welcome along. You know how this works. When we do our Clubland Q&As live in audio around the planet, I take questions from Mark Steyn Club members all over the world. We always have a few left over, and I like to pick them up when we do these video editions of Mark's Mailbox. Let's get to it. Lots of good questions. Scott Scherzer says, "Dear Mark, I'm hoping you can explain Donald Trump's seemingly supernatural powers. In less than one term as president, he has managed to make the Democrat Party pro-war, anti-budget deficit, rule of law strict constitutionalists. Is there a chance that by November 2020 they will be for traditional marriage and insist there are only two genders?" There's actually is a sporting chance of that, Scott, because it's pretty clear now that if Donald Trump is for it, they're against it, whatever it is. The most obvious example, of course, being Russia. You'll recall that when Mitt Romney raised the specter of Russia in the 2012 presidential election, Obama sneered at him that the 1980s were wanting their foreign policy back. The minute Trump took that position, that in fact there's nothing to fear about Russia, what's wrong with Russia, let's all get on with Russia, from that moment on, the Democrats decided that colluding with Russia was the worst thing you can do. It's about power. The Democrats are serious about power and about what's necessary to hold on to power. An internal inconsistency is irrelevant if it stands in the way of power. The Syria thing is very interesting. Essentially, these are policy disputes. And at heart, what's going on with both Syria and Ukraine is that you have the bureaucracy, which is at odds with the president. But the president is the lawfully elected executive branch. It's him. He runs it. He's elected, and he's entitled to have the policies he favors and on which he was elected put into practice. And the permanent bureaucracy is telling him, no, you can't. And the Democrats are going along with that. And I think that's actually broader than a left-right thing, because it ties into what's happened with Brexit in the UK too, and various other features of life in the European Union and elsewhere, which is that there genuinely is a permanent state. It doesn't matter whether it's a deep state or a shallow state. A lot of the so-called deep states thinking is in fact quite shallow. But there is a permanent state, and it doesn't want anybody coming along and stepping outside the very narrow bounds in which that permanent state operates. More Trump? Robert asks, very general question here. A lot of people accuse the Donald of outright lying. I find that he exaggerates a lot, as do I. But he's nearly always basically quite accurate. I have a dear friend who insists that the Donald is a congenital liar to the extent that he doesn't even realize he's doing it, while I take the above tack. As this issue has been with us for over 4 years now and likely isn't even at the halfway mark yet, I have to ask you, liar or exaggerator? I don't think he is lying. I don't think he does lie. He has the showbiz tick of simply being a bit more rhetorically extravagant than would be required by human-size persons. Tony Bennett does this too. Whenever some unfortunate chanteuse expires prematurely, Tony, lovely fellow, always hails her as the greatest female vocalist of all time. As far as I can tell, he's been doing this since Judy Garland died half a century ago. But he's done it for Amy Winehouse. He's done it for Whitney Houston. Whoever your favorite female vocalist is, if she were to be found suddenly pushing up daisies, Tony Bennett would say she's the greatest female vocalist who ever lived. It's awfully decent of him to do that. And I think Trump, having been in show business for many years, has that aspect of him, the lounge act aspect. I love President Xi in Beijing. He's a fabulous guy. He's great. That whole side of him, the schmoozing lounge act side, is quite genuine. But the point here which, as has been said before, is that Trump's supporters take him seriously but not literally, and his detractors take him literally but not seriously. I forget who it was who made that point in the course of the 2016 campaign, and we see it. Very early on in his presidency, he made some remarks about Sweden. What's going on in Sweden? And everybody mocked him because, according to the Democrats and according to the American media and according to the Swedish government, nothing's going on in Sweden. And in fact, Trump was absolutely right. Swedes are going to be an ethnic minority within their own country by the year 2050. That's pretty damn big. Sweden admitted so many excitable young quote-unquote refugees that among the 16 to 18 demographic cohort, it now has a bigger sex imbalance as it took China's youth to get to with 40 years of the one-child program. So it has far more boys in their late teens than girls. 58% of rapes are perpetrated by persons of foreign origin. And when it comes to rape by someone unknown to the victim, the figure rises to over 80%. It has the highest rate of explosions of any developed nation. Mysteriously, in cities like Malmo and Stockholm, and Helsingborg and Gothenburg, bars and shops and apartment blocks detonate mysteriously. It has all these features of life that mean that Sweden is not how we used to think of Sweden. People used to talk about the Swedish model, by which they didn't mean Britt Eklund, who is the kind of Swedish model I like to think about, but they meant the Swedish model of social democracy. Bernie Sanders still goes on about this. When he talks about socialism, democratic socialism, he and the young of America are thinking of somewhere like Sweden, where it's basically pacifism and free love in the hot tub. And that Sweden is dying. And Trump grasped that. And the essential truth of that is very typical of what Donald Trump says. He says something, it drives the Democrats and the media batty, mainly because we have a know-nothing media. I mean, how many newspapers, for example, when he talks about Sweden, just as a for instance, I wouldn't claim to be a big Swedish expert. I go to Malmo once every couple of years and always do the walk down to Rosengard, and I'll watch the leggy Swedish blondes thinning out and the big, fierce, bearded men of Rosengard coming towards me. And every couple of years when I do that walk at sunset, the Swedish blondes die out a little earlier on the walk, and the big, bearded men of a certain demographic persuasion are more numerous and start earlier. And I don't claim to be a big Swedish expert, but let me ask you this. How many Swedish correspondents does the average American TV network have? How many people do you think CBS has reporting on the news in Sweden? So when they all scoff at Trump, they know nothing. And he actually, you may mock his rhetorical style, but he actually got to the heart of the reality of the situation, which is that something is going on and going on very fast. Syrian raid, the Syrian raid on al-Baghdadi. Don't you love that guy? Chris Hall, our favorite Macedonian content farmer, says, Mark, because of the maneuverings by the US administration in Syria, it strikes me that given US energy independence, President Trump has calculated that it's no longer necessary or even desirable for America to play the great game. A little bit of Kipling there. Play the great game in the Middle East. It seems that the only bits of real estate that are worth much anymore are Israel and maybe the Suez Canal. If that's true, do you think that the UK, EU, Japan, India, and China will be deputized as the US sheriff leaves town? Who else can sit on the zoo fraternity in the Gulf region? That's actually quite an interesting point, Chris. What we think of as the Middle East used to be called the Near East, because in the old joke of the British Foreign Office, it's much nearer than you think, and it is. It borders NATO. Syria borders NATO, in theory, if you still regard Turkey as a functioning member of NATO. The two powers you didn't mention there, actually, are Turkey, which certainly has regional ambitions, and Russia, which is back in Syria in a big way. Nothing to do with Trump. Nothing to do with Trump at all. They recovered their position in the Middle East basically during the Obama administration. You'll remember that people like John Kerry suddenly decided that Assad was unacceptable and he had to go. And Assad, as you might have noticed, is still there, and he's got reliable patrons who meant it at a time when the United States didn't. Does any of this matter to Americans? I would say a couple of things. Americans don't want to be in the Middle East. If we're in the Middle East for energy needs, then instead of finding ourselves yoked to Saudi Arabia, which comes with all kinds of baggage, then it makes more sense to be energy independent. If you look at the new sources of energy, if you look at the new sources of oil and gas that are going to emerge before the year 2030, almost all of them are coming from the United States and more generally North America, if you include bits of Canada, assuming Justin Trudeau doesn't put a stop to all that. For example, Pennsylvania, which nobody thinks of as a big, as Texas or even as these new fracking states in the Mountain West, but Pennsylvania is going to be the world's third biggest source of new energy in the next decade or so. So why not get your energy from Pennsylvania rather than Saudi Arabia? It's not difficult, because Saudi Arabia's principal export is not oil, it's ideology. All the oil money does is fund the export of the ideology. And the export of the ideology is what leads to Mohammed Atta flying in through the office window one day. So it's not just that we no longer need oil from these places, it's that it's actually in our long-term strategic interest to make these guys poorer. Because when they're poorer, they can't have their walking around money turning hitherto moderate corners of Islam, such as the Balkans and Central Asia, not to mention Britain and Europe and Canada and Australia and America and what have you. They don't have the walking around money to fund all the new mosques and madrasas. Who does it matter to? It matters to China. If you notice, in recent years, China has refurbished all the old, they basically reversed Britain's old trading route. The Middle East was important to Britain because it was the route to India. So that's why you needed the Suez Canal. That's how you got stuff to India and India got stuff to you. And if you're running the Indian subcontinent and you need to get there in a hurry, you go through the Middle East. And if you look even to British army garrisons in the Middle East, they were essentially run from London, but they were formerly garrisons of the Indian Army, because those outposts of empire in Arabia and the Horn of Africa were essentially part of an Indian subcontinental strategy. And China has kind of duplicated that in reverse now. They've taken all Britain's Indian Ocean ports and refurbished them, going from China west to the Middle East, because it's important to them for resources in Africa and for other reasons. I think the strategic goal in the Middle East is actually an economic one, as I said, to make them poorer. We can't really get a grip on their ideology or their ideological disposition. When we try to, it doesn't work out so well. We went into Iraq and we basically liberated Iraq brilliantly in military terms, and then strategically turned it into an operating subsidiary of Iran, which is stupid and not in America's interest. We tried to distinguish between various unsavory fellows and wind up as tourists in the heart of darkness. So that we all rejoice when Mubarak gets toppled, and then we're stunned when the Muslim Brotherhood guy comes to power, and his principal rival in Egypt's elections is the even more Muslim Brotherhood. We simply have no clue. We're babes in the desert. And there's no point getting mixed up in that, because they only matter. They only matter because they're far wealthier than they should be, because we have prioritized buying the oil of regimes that are ideologically opposed to us rather than looking for energy sources close at home. Scott says, since the world's elites are trying to replace their populace with a more compliant population, is there any way we can replace our elites? What will it take? A revolution, evolution, or must we slowly watch Western civilization decline into totalitarianism? Trump's time in office will be looked on as a moderate success, I think. He has been fighting the administrative state for the past 3 years, and I think Schiff's impeachment and the New York Times show that the deep state is real and doing everything it can do to stop every part of Trump's agenda. Our government has moved so far away from its founding and is now just a massive bureaucracy that wants to stay in power and control every aspect of our lives. A lot of truth to that. As I said at the time of the election, when basically all the money guys, the donor class, whom I loathe, I really do. I really do. It should be on the Republican side. I think the Democrat donors get a lot more bang for their buck, because the Democrats get into office and deliver Obamacare and gay marriage, and they deliver for their donors. The Republican donor class is stupid if the object is to advance Republican Party policy goals. So as it doesn't, one assumes that this money is a way of deflecting the Republican Party from actually accomplishing its public policy goals. And we had a lot of talk in the 2016 election about the donors obviously not liking Trump, and they still put their money on Jeb, and if Jeb faltered a bit, well, they'd put it on Marco Rubio or whoever. And I made the point that it's easier for the base to get itself a new elite than it is for the elite to get itself a new base. If elections matter, then obviously the views of millions and millions and millions of voters matter more than the views of a few thousand high-rolling donors. The lesson we've learned from the last 3 years in America and Britain and elsewhere is that as far as the elite is concerned, elections don't matter. And the problem facing a chap like Donald Trump, or any outsider, really, because the same can be said of outsiders in other parts of the world, is you can elect an outsider to sit atop the government, but all the insiders are going to do then is try and screw him over, take him captive, make the outsider the prisoner of the insiders. So the lesson, I think, from the impeachment fight, the Russia investigation, and all the rest is you've got to have more than one outsider. You can have the biggest, larger-than-life outsider in the world, and he will be Gulliver ensnared by 1,000 Adam Schiff-sized Lilliputians. But they are fighting a serious battle here to tell you that if you vote outside the approved bounds, you can vote for bringing people out of the shadows on immigration. That's fine. You can be an open borders fanatic, or you can say we need to find a pathway to citizenship. But if you actually vote for someone who says, no, we don't need immigration, no developed nation needs mass immigration in an age of increasing automation. So we'd like serious immigration enforcement, starting with a wall on the southern border. If you do that, if you vote for someone like that, the elite, the bureaucracy is there to teach you that you can vote for that, but you ain't going to get it. You can vote for Brexit, which means that a country that is part of a increasingly centralized superstate is now once more a sovereign nation, if you vote for that, you can do it, but you're not going to get it. You're going to wind up with some watered down, diluted pseudo Brexit. I want to get to some big. Benjamin Poser sent us so many big picture questions that I want to at least get to a couple of them. Here's his first one. Mark, continuing with the inevitability of civilizational collapse, do you, like many others, believe that when such a collapse takes place, due to either an Iranian electromagnetic pulse attack or the debt bomb exploding, many will actually enjoy being cleansed of the technology and societal structures which have given most so much misery? As a bon vivant defender of modern civilization yourself, do you think that many so-called common people would prefer to just live in the natural simplicity of 7,000 years ago, shorn of technology and desk jobs? That's from Ben Poser in Boston. Ben, I don't want to live like I did 7,000 years ago when life was nasty, brutish, and short. But I think actually you would find quite a few takers who would like to turn the clock back to some point. And again, these are never perfect. The past is never perfect, the present is never perfect, the future is never perfect. And that's why people monkey with the past. And we have things like steampunk or whatever, or some of these sci-fi films where you take aspects of the past and aspects of the future and they exist side by side. And I think there's certainly aspects of the past that people would like. I think that's one of the reasons for the resurgence of nationalism. I do think people miss cohesive nation states. I think actually there's quite a few people who would be happy living sort of somewhere in the late 19th century and in which we had a dynamic age of scientific invention that was something other than just waiting for the little electronic gizmo that you can listen to Taylor Swift on. I think there'd be quite a few takers for that. My concern, though, is that if we ever do have the Iranian EMP attack any day now, in case you don't know this is one of those things where they detonate a nuke in the upper atmosphere and it vaporizes basically anything that requires a computer to run it. So that's not the things just the things you think of as automatic, like, say, your bank records, which are instantly vaporized, but also most automobiles, for example, which now basically run on computers. And if the computer stops working, you can't get that car to run. So you're going to be having to go around the neighborhood and see if Grandpa's still got a 1958 Edsel around the back of the garage that you can steal and hotwire. That's what it's going to be. And they always say, oh, well, that will return us to the state of the world in the mid-19th century. It's going to return us to the state of the world in the mid-19th century with none of the skills of the mid-19th century. The people who used to be able to do things are now don't have those skills. Now they're just a transgender studies graduate. And you can't barter that once you have a primitive society, such as we had in the mid-19th century, where you have a blacksmith and you have a millwright and you have a dairy farmer and you have a sheep farmer, and instead we don't have anything like that. So we have a Starbucks barista and we have a transgender studies graduate. It's going to be a lot harder running a mid-19th century society with what they think are 21st century skills. I used to love reading my daughter stories before she got all teenagey. And when she was like 7 or 8, I read her Little House on the Prairie. And there's a chapter in there in which her dad shingles the roof of the little cabin, log cabin they're building on the prairie. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, it's a long time since I've followed Little House on the Prairie. I haven't read it in years. So I'm assuming the episode, the chapter about shingling the roof, is that at some point the dad's, he's shingling the roof and he's going to fall off the roof and crack his back and he's going to be laid up and it's going to be a crisis for the family. I assumed something was going to happen. But in fact, no. It's just a chapter about shingling the roof. And at the end of the chapter, he shingles the roof and he comes down and the roof is shingled. And the little girl, Laura, has watched her dad shingle the roof. I read this to my daughter and I was thinking, gosh, she must be a bit disappointed about this. I mean, how would you even make a movie of it? There's no 20-minute CGI battle scene in it or anything. Just shingling the roof. And as it happened, I had to have the porch roof re-shingled a couple of weeks later. And the guy came round and was shingling the roof. I came out and caught my daughter looking up at him and talking to him. And the guy said to me, wow, your daughter knows a lot about shingling the roof. So it was useful. It was useful. Ask yourself now, how many of the safe space generation could get up on the porch roof and shingle the roof? We're going to be a mid-19th century society with 21st century skills is a recipe for the abyss. And I have another question. Like Ben Post, I said he had all these big picture questions. And he's got another one here. Regarding the young, as we call those who have vacated the womb for fewer than 40 years, might be more like 50 years actually, Ben, and they're both understandable and repulsive attraction to socialism. Do you think that this propensity could include the spectre of such creatures actually adopting the beliefs of Muhammad, and Muhammad and company? It would be a pity to desert the Germans in joining the folds of the Islamic State. You're being a bit gloomy there, Ben, but I think you've got a good point here. I talked with Tucker a couple of weeks back about on the TV about how the millennial generation and Generation Z, whatever it is that comes after millennials, were hotter for socialism than any prior generations in American history. And that's, of course, and people say, well, wait a minute, don't they know about the gulags? Don't they know about Mao's Cultural Revolution? Don't they know about the mountains of corpses all over the world? No, they don't. No, they don't. It's the arrogance of every generation to assume that it's the first to find all the answers to life. You know this when with late teenagers, they think they're the only ones who, or they did, they're the first people to ever discover sex. What is it? Philip Larkin's poem, Sexual Intercourse, began in 1963 between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. The truth in that thing is that every generation thinks they're the first truly liberated generation, and the prior generations are just uptight and don't get it, and you are finally the peak of human wisdom. But that goes quadruple or quintuple with this generation, because it's now possible to live in a hyper-present tense where you're not aware, you're barely aware of anything that pre-existed 10 years ago. You don't even know about that. And so when you talk about gulags and the cultural, nobody knows anything about that. And when you say, will that ultimately lead them to Muhammad, to Islam, I wrote a few years ago that I can see, certainly in Europe, you look at companies now, they've got a small percentage of Muslim workers. Eventually, those guys demand the right to have a prayer room and to break for prayers on Friday, say. So they demand the right to have a company prayer room and break for prayers. And there's just a few Muslims at first. And then there become a few more and a few more. And suddenly it's maybe, you know, it's getting up to 47, 48%. And then it tiptoes over into 50%. And you start to feel a little bit out of place, you and the dwindling numbers of people who don't go off to the prayer room when they have the prayer breaks. And it's easy to see when you look already at Muslim conversion rates in Europe, that people will just start deciding, oh yeah, well, what the hell, it's prayers, I'll just string along. I don't want to look out of place, I'll string along. But there's a stage that, and I do believe that will happen, but there's a stage that comes before that. And we see it already, which is that the progressive left is actually reaching the same position as hardcore Islam on issues like free speech. Basically, Islam takes the view that there's a whole panoply of things that can't be questioned. Well, who does that sound like? That's where the left is already at when it comes to same-sex marriage or abortion or climate change or you name it. All that's left to negotiate is, and indeed Islam. The BBC recently got rid of a long-time Sikh contributor because they thought what he was about to say was potentially insensitive to Islam. And it's tough for the guy, he's a Sikh. But the reality is that the BBC is more cautious about offending Islam than about offending Sikhs. So in a sense, the same protections that Islam puts around Islam, the left is already putting around Islam. So it'll be easy for them to get mixed up, and it's not such a big step to then actually sign on to that in a more official way. One looks at other aspects too, and one sees the left essentially adopting the same proscriptive attitude to life as Islam does. For example, baby, it's cold outside. Saib Katoub went to a church dance in Greeley, Colorado, and heard baby, it's cold outside, and he was revolted by the mixed couples dancing sensuously to baby, it's cold outside. And he went back to Egypt and he became the intellectual powerhouse behind the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, now, 70 years later, the new generation are just as offended by baby, it's cold outside as Saib Katoub was. So it's taken basically 70 years for the youth of America to reach the same position on baby, it's cold outside as the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's not a big step when you actually have the same approach to free speech, freedom of expression, the mediation of social relations. It's not a big step when you've already essentially adopted the same approach to actually go all the way and sign up with Mohammed and company. Thank you for all your questions. We will do this again next time. Remember, we do it in audio with our Clubland Q&As and then on video with Mark's Mailbox. But in audio or video, we hope to see you for our next edition. So long.